I want to start with the proposition that the real education revolution in Australia began in 1880 with the passage of Henry Parkes's Public Instruction Act. What Henry Parkes's Public Instruction Act said is that every Australian, whether they are the child of a timber getter or the child of an urban bourgeoisie, has the right to a quality, secular education. And he created one of the world's first universal, comprehensive public education systems. One of those we heard earlier today about the radical liberals of the late 19th and early 20th century. Henry Parkes was one of those radical liberals. If you go into my office, you'll see a photo of Henry Parkes up on the wall. A great and revolutionary notion that changed Australia forever to make it a much more cohesive, much more successful society. That revolution proceeded through primary school to secondary school. In about 1900, Australia started building public sector vocational education and training, working men's colleges, taking the schools of arts and making them public sector, with the idea through the technical colleges and then into the TAFE system that every Australian, regardless of their intellectual abilities and interests, regardless of what their parents believed, what their parents' ability or interest in education was, every Australian would get education. Not just skills, but education. Starting in the early 1980s, there was a counter-revolution. And I want to spend most of my talk today talking about the counter-revolution, the neoliberal counter-revolution. And I want to approach it by two seemingly irrefutable slogans that are the lead points, the vertices of the neoliberal counter-revolution against the 1880s Henry Parkes-led revolution. And the first of those is school choice, and the second of those is skills for work. And both of those, to me, when you first hear them, you say them often enough, and I invite you to do this: skills for work, skills for work, skills for work, school choice, and you can mix them up, and sooner or later, you too will believe in the neoliberal philosophy of education. It works every time. I know that works because every politician in the New South Wales Parliament, bar 6, believe that, because they've said it too often. Let's just take school choice first of all. It begins with the idea that parents have a right to choose where their child goes to school. Sounds kind of reasonable. That concept is reinforced by three key political forces. The first has been the power of the religious elites, particularly the Anglican and the Catholic churches, who each run their own school systems and who each have said that school choice means that parents should have the right to be subsidised to go to those schools. That's been reinforced in the last 20 years by the incredible growth of muscular proselytising Protestantism. Not the traditional Protestantism, but the new Protestantism, the Protestantism that is vehemently evangelistic and that goes out and recruits and aims at recruiting children and is building schools since the advent of John Howard, is building schools like they're going out of business. Which takes us to the second reinforcing feature, that which has been the power of the swinging voters. There's been enormous pressure in outer suburban electorates and on the Central Coast and in the Hunter, and I must say on the South Coast as well, to allow communities to build their own schools, particularly dissenting Christian communities to build their own schools. And they've put enormous pressure, because many of these are marginal seats, they've put pressure to get additional resources to back up school choice. And the third force that's contributed to this has been the desire of politicians to cut taxes. And so by instead of having everybody paying for all education through taxes, you privatise part of that process, and we end up now paying about half as much for a child. The state ends up paying about half as much for a child in private education, non-government education, as they do in public education. So what school choice, starting with school choice and feeding it through those three forces, has become is a Thatcherite expression, as of today, it is a Thatcherite expression of the idea of privatisation. Where we've ended up in New South Wales alone is what was in 2003, for example, $2.5 billion of state and federal money going to non-government schools is now $3.7 billion. And I've adjusted those figures for inflation. So after inflation, over the 12 years, the previous 12 years, there has been a 48% growth in the amount of public funds going to non-government schools. What that has meant is, in effect, $1.2 billion that is not in public education each year, which interestingly enough is very close to the full Gonski amount for public education. What that has meant has been a robbing of public education of its diversity of students, as students with parents who are interested in education increasingly shift out of public education. It has meant a segregation of education opportunity by class, by ethnicity and by religion, and particularly a growth in the more evangelistic religions. And it has meant primarily that the educational outcome for a child is more determined by the wealth levels and the educational interest of parents than it has ever been since 1880. It has also meant massive amounts of taxpayers' dollars going into schools that simply don't need it. One private school close to here, parents pay about $32,700 per year per student. For reasons that I can't explain to you, that school gets an additional $3,300 per student from the state and federal government. That's about $3.3 million a year of state and federal government going into a school, a private school, Sydney Grammar, that already spends 3 times what is spent at the average public school and 3.2 times what is spent at a selective public school. And by the way, it doesn't get as good a results as the selective public schools, which is an interesting contradiction in what I'm about to say. But that's not the end point of it. Where we are in 2015 is just halfway down the process. And if we want to see where this ends up, we take a quick look across at the United States and at parts of Europe, particularly Sweden and the United Kingdom. What Maury Mulheron, the president of the New South Wales Teachers Federation, refers to as a global education reform movement, a movement that takes the idea of school choice one step further and says, well, school is about a choice, and if you're going to have choice, you need a market. If you're going to have market, you need competition between schools. And we saw the first protoplasm of the germ come into Australia with Julia Gillard and her affair, her intellectual affair, with a guy called Joel Klein, who used to work for Coca-Cola and then became the Chancellor of the New York School District. And he set school against school, teacher against teacher, because he believed schools were units of production. Teachers were workers in units of production, and the best way to do things is to measure their outputs. And if you measure their outputs and tell the consumer, not the citizen, but the consumer, what the outcome is, the consumer will make more informed choices. That means things like the My School website being used to determine the pay of teachers. It means things like teachers losing permanency and being told that they have to recompete for their job. It's happening in America, it's happening in Sweden, it's happening in the UK. It is minutes away from coming here in Australia, with both major political parties committed to that agenda. I want to go to the second neoliberal attack on education, and that is skills for work. And who can argue against skills for work? Well, I'm going to. I'm going to do it because if you follow skills for work, the slogan of skills for work, which was picked up, by the way, by the ACTU, our union leaders, in 1983 and pushed through the Accord, if you follow that to its logical conclusion, you get to Victoria. Not a nice place to be if you believe in equality of opportunity for education for working class Australians. The share of TAFE, the share of vocational education and training in Victoria, when I first looked at it in the early 2000s, was about 85 to 90%. It is now down to 27%. 73% of vocational education and training in Victoria is now delivered by the non-TAFE sector, mostly the large corporations that are circling around and taking hundreds of millions of dollars as profit out of the vocational education and training budget, but with terrible consequences for the young people involved and terrible consequences for all of us. How this worked in brief was this. We start with the concept of skills for work, and this goes through the Accord process, signed off in various versions between 1983 and 1996 by the then Labor government, the Hawke-Keating government, and the ACTU. And one of the things it said was, we want our people trained, and we want them trained on the basis of competency. This was the ACTU talking. We want competency-based training. We don't want to muck about with our kids being tied up in TAFE forever. We want them trained so as they're competent for work and they can be retrained in new competencies. Sounds fine. But what does that really mean? It means you reduce the concept of education for working class Australians and for Australians who are going to be skilled in their workplace, not necessarily with a university education. You reduce it down from education to skills, and it becomes a thing called training packages, where you define what those skills are by a measurable set of things, abilities that people can do. The minute you do that, the minute you divorce skills training from education, the minute you take away the concept of the uniqueness of education, the transformative values of education, you absolutely make TAFE irrelevant. Because if it's just about giving people skills, just about training people up, not bothering with giving them the context in which they're going to work, not bothering to give them the critical skills that every citizen needs, not bothering to give them the educational values of understanding a broader society, but just what they need to do at the workplace, then anybody can deliver that. You don't need a qualified teacher. Indeed, in New South Wales, many private providers of vocational education and training do not have qualified teachers. You don't need to bother with complex things like numeracy and literacy. You just need enough of that to get those kids into a workplace. And most importantly, if you're going to make it a commodity, and it's become a commodity, the best thing to do with a commodity is trade it through a market. And that's precisely what happened in Victoria with the ridiculously named training guarantee. It was no guarantee, which saw TAFE go into complete collapse in that state and has seen TAFE get less than 27% of the training budget. And in New South Wales, it's called Smart and Skilled. And I actually ended up on a radio interview on the North Coast in one of those ridiculous things where the journalist says, well, how can you argue against something called Smart and Skilled? It's a great name. It's like Arbeit sind frei, work makes you free, across the top of every concentration camp. That kind of work doesn't make you free. This kind of market does not make you smart or skilled, but most importantly, it does not make you educated. And that is the fundamental proposition. Next year, first half of 2015, if we don't stop it, and I believe we can stop it, $630 million of the training budget, the education and training budget of New South Wales, about 40% of the training budget will be in the contestable market, where private providers and TAFE will be competing against each other for money. Initially, it won't be as bad as Victoria. My guess is that TAFE will end up with about 65% of the training market next year. But it will be a slow-moving version of Victoria. Our politicians and bureaucrats have learnt from the public relations disaster that engulfed Victoria, and we will see a slow decline. They will slowly hand over our budget. And what does it mean? What does it mean in the long term? It means people with disabilities will disappear from the workforce because they won't get the educational support they need to survive. It means people from non-English speaking backgrounds will find it much harder to get training. People with educational deficits for whom school didn't work will not get access to education. But critically, it means every working class Australian, instead of going to TAFE and being educated, will end up with a for-profit private provider being skilled. This is a difficult century. We have to cope with greenhouse. We're going to have to cope with an increasingly divided world and with huge tensions within our own communities, we heard this morning. The last thing we want is a mass of Australians who cannot tell the difference between Ellen Jones and Phillip Adams, who cannot sort out the lies and the deceit that is on the internet, that pour through the internet because they have not been educated. The last thing we want to do is take away from every Australian the promise that Henry Parkes gave them, that they would be educated not just so that they can work, but so that they understand the culture that they come from. They understand the politics in which they live, they understand the social forces, the history and the religion of our society. That fundamental promise is being stolen from us by those two simple neoliberal propositions: school choice and skills for work. I finish with this proposition. Henry Parkes was not perfect. Our public education system has not been perfect. But we have led the world in making sure that we have everybody with the opportunity for education. We are giving that up for the sake of a series of neoliberal slogans. The real revolution is to get back to the fundamental missions of public education, to talk about every Australian, whether they're a migrant kid, whether they have a disability, or whether they have a superb ability. Every Australian, whether they're interested in Plato or whether they're interested in Ford Falcons, it doesn't matter. Every Australian has the right to engage through education. That is a revolution that your Greens MPs are working for. Thank you very much.